All right. Well, happy Wednesday. Welcome to our noon study lunch session at Congregation Beth Sholom. It is Wednesday, April 21st, 2021. I just wanted to follow up. We're going to continue from last week's discussion about the Jewish notion of the Messiah. But I also want to acknowledge when I bite off more than I can chew. And I think from time to time, we have in this class, what I like to do is take this hour, and I just like to usually contain it within an hour, a nice class, and get something meaty for us to dig our teeth into. But sometimes I bring in stuff that could not possibly be dug into in the course of 60 minutes. And I think Sholom is one of them. I spent 3 hours this morning attempting to see if I could narrow down the Sholom in a way that would allow for us to do it in this 60 minutes. And ultimately, I decided it probably wouldn't be worth the effort. And so what I want to do here is I have the Sholom, and I want to zip through the Sholom and just discuss where we were last week. But then I want to bring in a modern article. Modern. It was modern. It's about 21 years old, written by Bill Joy, which is titled "Why the Future Doesn't Need Us." And it was a very famous, well-received article that was written in Wired at the turn of the century. And it, I think, deals with some of the issues that sit at the heart of our discussion around messianism and apocalypticism and a modern context. So with that in mind, Judah, yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sometimes let me stick this in. So I wanted to ask this question last week. It's not really off topic, but it's a little off topic. And so I'll try to ask it quickly because nobody's been able to answer it for me. And I certainly know you're a conservative rabbi, but you're also a smart guy, so maybe you can answer it for me. So is that better? Anyway.
It's all good.
When I left San Francisco, I moved to Placerville. And since I go to shul every Shabbos, it was Chabad. And so I went for a couple of years. And of course, they were uberly welcoming and wonderful people. And, 2 years was a year too much. But, and now because of politics, I have very negative feelings about that, plus some other things. But so can you explain to me, which none of them can, and I've gotten different answers, Melech, Schneerson, Moshiach.
Oh, Mamash?
Melech, Moshiach, Schneerson.
Yeah, so I have prepared this text from Sholom, and he deals not with this exact issue, but he deals with this impulse, which is very hard to resist, which is the impulse, as I like to call it, to make a run at the Messiah. It's like to make a run at the presidency or to make a run at anything really large. There are some people throughout history who have taken up the mantle and tried to make a run at claiming of the Messiah, and have had different groups and people who are with them and who buy into that claim. And there is a very strong, what's known as a Mashiachtis segment of Chabad Lubavitch, of which I don't know too much about, so I really can't speak intelligently about their theology, that believes that Menachem Mendel Schneerson was the Mashiach. And that when I was living in New York, there would be big billboards with his image on it saying the Mashiach is here. And they went through all of the different categories in the Talmud that Sholom will briefly touch upon to indicate that he had fit all of the biblical categories for Mashiach.
He doesn't.
And then when he died,
died.
The movement was fractured in half between people who still wanted to maintain that he was the Messiah and people who felt the need to move on and that his death was a sign that he was not the Messiah. And that feud continues to this day. There are still people in
I've heard
the
it said,
Chabad world.
Rabbi, I've heard it said, there's two kinds of Lubavitchers. Those who think Schneerson was Moshiach and will tell you so, and those who think Schneerson was Moshiach and won't tell you so.
Yeah,
I mean,
I was at a.
it's pretty.
I don't. It's
Yeah,
hard. It's hard for them. You have to understand. Like I lived I lived in one town over from Crown Heights, and I spoke to a lot of people who studied with Schneerson and grew up in that community. And it's such a beautiful, the way they describe the beautiful feeling and the magic and the majesty of that. It's very hard to give that up. And I was at a Farbrengen at one point in which somebody, against the rules, gave a bracha with the Mashiach verbiage in it and got some negative scorns because I was there and some other people were there from some of the other people for using that language. So, but it's at its heart, it's a theological dispute. And I'm going to go on, Judah. And what I want to show you is that it's really in the text itself that Sholom gets into how this happens. So I can get stuck here, and we will, there's a real danger for us getting lost here, and I don't want that to happen. So what I want to do is try to sum up very quickly what I think is the heart of the sort of dispute here. And maybe you give me a little bit of time, maybe 10 minutes to do that. And then I'll open it back up, because then I want to get into a popular article that'll be easier for us to read and discuss and hopefully contemplate, I guess, where we are right now in the nature of society and how we're doing and all of that sort of stuff, which I think this can lend itself nicely to once I figure out how to utilize the technology. Okay, so as we discussed last week, Sholom talks about these three kinds of forces that are in Judaism. There's the conservative force that tries to preserve that which has existed. There's the restorative forces that want to go back to some previous condition. And then there's a utopian force that is inspired to some future date to imagine something which has not yet existed. And we talked about how when the messianic idea appears as a living force, it often, when people really are connected with messianism, right? Like maybe towards the end of a millennium, like in the 90s with Schneerson. When you approach this end of a millennium and Y2K and whatever, you think you're coming to an end of a historical period, Messiah really appears in a strong way. And its connection to apocalyptic thinking. And what we talked about last week was that the predictions and the messages that we get from our biblical prophets are spoken from the context of their own individual situations. They're human. Amos or Isaiah, they talk about the kingdom collapsing. So the messianic message of the prophets is natural. But then as we move ahead to the Apocrypha and to the book of Daniel, we have this notion of apocalypticism that begins to change the idea of how we think about the end of days from a historical kingdom that is rebuilt into some esoteric, secret, mystical, otherworldly experience that will come upon us. Right? I think that kind of explains it a little bit. And then once we've evolved, the Mishnah and the Talmud and the legends and the Kabbalists develop from this sort of new era, ideas of resurrection of the dead, the reward and punishment in the last judgment, and the paradise and hell. In fact, what I want to do here is I'm going to put this document with my highlights into the chat. And that way we can, hold on one second. Let's see. Okay. That way, if you want to just review this on your own time, feel free to. Okay, because I'm obviously going through it quickly. All right, so
Rabbi,
then
quick question.
Yeah, of course.
The chat dies at the end of the class. Is there any way to keep it going so we can just do it late, after we're finished?
The chat.
Anyway, just
well, the class is being recorded, so that continues. I don't know. I guess the chat.
This link also, you can when you click on it, you can download it onto your computer.
Okay.
It's a
Okay,
PDF.
great. Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's all right, Howard. Thank
For
you.
discussion.
I appreciate the question. Okay, so, and because this new apocalypticism comes in, this esoteric thinking, this Kabbalistic notion, then the words of our original prophets like Isaiah, which initially appeared probably pretty related to 586 and the destruction of the temple, they now become riddles, allegories, and mysteries. All right, that's sort of what happens. Okay, so then, all right, let's move on quickly. And in almost, all right, then we have these two forces. Messianic apocalypticism orders the old promises and traditions under two new aspects. There's the catastrophic and the destructive nature, and the utopianism. So we have these two main, what does he say, aspects. The first aspect is catastrophe, right? If we're going to have a new world come in, there has to be some cataclysm. So Sholom says, make no mistake, Jewish messianism is a theory of catastrophe. This theory stresses the cataclysmic event and the unprecedented historical nature that will come upon the Messiah's arrival. All right. And then, of course, there's the utopian aspect of it, which is what is the sum and substance of that world to come. All right. Now, Sholom will point out that there have been attempts to eliminate the apocalypticism because it's irrational. So Maimonides, as well as some other rationalist thinkers, try to make sense of it. And Sholom writes, this denial of apocalypticism set out to suppress exceedingly vital elements in the realm of Judaism, elements filled with historical dynamism, even if they combine destructive with constructive forces. And Sholom wants you to know that the ideal that all apocalyptic currents of the pre-Christian age flowed into Christianity is a fiction. Plenty of this stuff continues in our tradition and in our faith. Okay, so apocalyptic thinking, he writes, always contains elements of dread and consolation intertwined. Our world is clearly messed up. Injustice reigns. It is broken. And yet we yearn for it to be completed, but we know at the same time that completion will probably be totally destabilizing. And so we talked a little bit about the birth pangs of the Messiah and that lack of transition, unknowingness of the transition between history and the redemption is stressed by the prophets. And he writes here that the redemption is not the product of imminent developments, such as we find in the modern Western reinterpretation. Rather, it is a transcendence breaking into history. All right, so the apocalyptics have cherished this pessimistic view of the world, pessimistic in the sense that that is something which is beyond their control. All right, so he gives an example from the Midrash here. I think this is the Midrash from Reb Chia. Rabbi Chia. It is told of Rabbi Chia, I'm down here in case anyone's interested, to give you a sense of this idea. It's told by Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon that they walked in the valley of Arbela early in the morning, and they saw a dawn breaking on the horizon. Thereupon Rav Chia said, so too is Israel's redemption. At first, it will be only very slightly visible, then it will shine forth more brightly, and only afterwards will it break forth in all of its glory. All right, so such a belief was very common among apocalyptic calculators in all ages whenever they sought schemata. So they tried to calculate it, but the apocalyptic calculation which relied on numbers and constellations, perhaps the stars. Certainly you're familiar with certain apocalyptic movements that have set times and dates. So in opposition to that, the no less powerful sentiment is that the Messianic age cannot be calculated, right? And so this was poignantly expressed in the Talmud in the 3rd century, in which it said, 3 things come unawares, the Messiah, a found article in a scorpion, right? So what are the things that always come upon you when you're not prepared for them? A found article. Yeah, my socks. Whenever I find a sock, it's always sort of a mystery about how I found a sock. A scorpion, yes, that would be quite shocking. And the Messiah. We cannot prepare ourselves. And with a sharper stress on the always possible end, we find if Israel would repent, even for a single day, they would instantly be redeemed and the Son of David would instantly come. So there's this notion of spontaneity. And in fact, it says down here, there can be no preparation for the Messiah. He comes suddenly, unannounced, and precisely when he is least expected or when hope has long been abandoned. All right, so this is the beginning of the moment of complete catastrophe. Now, he goes on and gives us a little bit from the catastrophic character of the redemption, and which is essential in all of the apocalypses. And it finds manifold expression in world wars. So what do these birth pangs look like? What do these catastrophic transitions look like? Wars, revolutions, how about epidemics, famines, economic catastrophe, and to an equal degree, apostasy and desecration of God's name, or forgetting of the Torah and upsetting all of the moral order to the point of dissolving the laws of nature. So this is, here's in the Mishnah, it says, in the footsteps of the Messiah, in the period of the Messiah's arrival, presumption will increase and respect disappear. The empire will turn to heresy and there will be no moral reproof. The house of assembly will become a brothel. Galilee will be laid waste and the people of the frontiers will wander from city to city and none will pity them. The wisdom of the scribes will become odious and those who shun sin will be despised. Truth will be nowhere to be found. Right? So that is sort of the sense of the catastrophe that will come. All right, now the Sanhedrin says that the Messiah will come only in an age which is either totally pure or totally guilty and corrupt. Little wonder, Sholom writes, in one such context, the Talmud cites the bold statement of the three famous teachers of the 3rd and 4th century, may he come, but I do not want to see him. Now that was my teacher at the seminary. We said, oh, we should have the Messiah come, but the Messiah should come tomorrow. All right, so he goes through here this concept of tikkun. Basically, he says that this Lurianic Kabbalistic concept of tikkun is not a restorative, I'm going to zip by this. It's not a restorative concept because it's not totally looking backwards, but that the completion, the takenat ha'olam, to bring together all of those fractured pieces at the beginning of civilization is a utopian idea in and of itself. Now, there's so much more to that, but I obviously want to move forward a little bit. Okay, so hold on one second. Okay. The Talmud teachers were already faced. So here's the question, Judah, that you began with. So I think we're going to come here very nicely now. Only 20 minutes in, not bad. The Talmudic teachers were faced with the question whether one may press for the end. That is to say, force its coming by one's own activity. Here we find a deep cleavage of opinion with regard to messianism. The dream was not always accompanied by the determination to do something for its realization. On the contrary, it is one of the most important characteristics of messianism that to the minds of a great many there was an abyss here. And this is not surprising, since precisely in the biblical text, which served as the basis for the crystallization of the messianic idea, it is nowhere made dependent upon human activity. Not in Amos's day of the Lord or in Isaiah's visions are they contingent upon human activity. Everything in truth, Sholom says, is attributed to God. And it is just this that lends a special character to the contradiction between what is and what shall be. And there are warnings against human actions to press for the end. In Song of Songs, it says, I adjure you, daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and by the hinds of the field, do not awaken or stir up love until it is ready. Rabbi Helbo comments, 4 vows are contained here. The Israelites are adjured not to revolt against the kingdoms of the world and not to press for the end. All right, so we have this idea here. How about 4th Ezra? You will certainly not want to hasten more than the Creator. So we have this warning again and again against doing this, but Judah, ever and again, Sholom writes, the revolutionary opinion that this attitude deserves to be overrun breaks through. We can't keep it at bay into the messianic actions of individuals or entire movements like the one you began with. This is the messianic activism in which utopianism becomes the lever by which to establish the messianic kingdom. One may perhaps formulate the question which produced the division of minds more potently, and it can be, can man master his own future? And the answer of the apocalyptist would be no. But the enticement to action, the call to fulfillment is inherent in this projection of the best in man upon his future, which is just what Jewish messianism in its utopian elements so emphatically sets forth. And so here he gives some examples. Your example is good. How about Shabtai Tzvi or Bar Kokhba? Other good examples, the legend of Rabbi Joseph de la Reina. He says, pictures in extreme fashion an individual's enticement to messianic actions. It's just very enticing to think you're the Messiah and to make a run at it, isn't it? That could be very, I mean, think about how enticing it is to be the president of the United States for some people. It describes, and I guess that's me looking very cynically upon this, and I acknowledge the cynicism. It describes the undertaking of a great teacher in Israel for whom the redemption is concentrated on shattering only one last barrier, right? So think of some great rabbi. He's changed the world over. He's gotten people to do mitzvahs and think about Judaism and love. But what more does he have to do to really fulfill the being the Messiah? Well, Sholom says there's one last barrier. In order to be the Messiah, it has to be done by magic. And so it must fail for just this reason. The legend of the great magician and Kabbalist who captured Samael, the devil, and thus could have been brought about the redemption if he had not fallen under the devil's sway. Such Joseph de la Reinas have never been lacking in Jewish life, whether they remain hidden in some corner of the exile or that they put up billboards along Flatbush Avenue. All right, so let's stop here before he gets to the figure of the Messiah, because I think that ultimately crystallizes this discussion and brings us to 25 minutes into the class, Bill Joy's essay from 20 years ago, which I want to discuss here. And I think it will be easier for us to get into a discussion on this. But hopefully you were able to follow the background so you can see the context for this discussion. And his question that he asks is why the future doesn't need us. I guess not a question, excuse me. He's stating why the future doesn't need us. And at this point, if you want to interrupt, I've already given my little bit of a lecture, so we can go back now to interrupting me with impunity. Okay, our most powerful 21st century technologies, robotics, genetic engineering, and nanotech are threatening to make humans an endangered species. This is April 2000, Wired magazine, and Bill Joy is the founder, if I'm not mistaken, of Sun Microsystems, is that right? Bill Joy at that point was the founder of, hold on one second. Yes, Sun Microsystems. Okay. All right. So from the moment I became involved in the creation of new technologies, their ethical dimensions have concerned me. But it was only in the autumn of '98 that I became anxiously aware of the great dangers facing us in the 21st century. I can date the onset of my unease to the day I met Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil is the current CTO at Google, the famous inventor who invented the first reading machine for the blind, among many other things. So he says he and Ray Kurzweil were speaking at this conference, and he had missed Ray's talk, in which he was talking about the improvement of technology going at a rapidly accelerated rate. So much so that at some point, humans will fuse with robots. Now, when Joyce says, when I had heard such talk before, I had always felt sentient robots were in the realm of science fiction. But now, from someone I respected, I was hearing a strong argument that they were a near-term possibility. I was taken aback, especially given Ray's proven ability to imagine and create the future. It's easy to get jaded about such breakthroughs. We hear in the news almost every day of some kind of technological advance. Oh, certainly in 2021. Yet this was no ordinary prediction. In the hotel bar, Ray gave me a partial preprint of his then forthcoming book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, which outlined a utopia, always a utopia, he foresaw, one in which humans gained near immortality by becoming one with robotic technology. On reading it, my sense of unease only intensified. I felt sure that he had been understating the dangers. I found myself most troubled by a passage detailing a dystopian scenario. It's called A New Luddite Challenge. So let me just read this and then we'll get some responses. First, let me postulate. This is a section from Kurzweil's book. First, let me postulate that the computer scientists succeed in developing intelligent machines that can do all the things better than human beings can do them. In that case, presumably all work will be done by systems of machines and algorithms with no human effort will be necessary. When that happens, either two cases might occur. These machines might be permitted to make all of their own decisions without human oversight, or else human control over the machines might be retained. If the machines are permitted to make all of their own decisions, we can't make any conjectures as to the results because it is impossible to guess how machines might behave. We only point out that the fate of the human race would be at the mercy of the machines. It might be argued that the human race would never be foolish enough to hand over all the power to the machines. But we are suggesting neither that the human race would voluntarily turn power over to the machine, nor that the machines would willfully seize power. What we do suggest from this manifesto is that the human race might easily permit itself to drift into a position of such dependence on the machines that it would have no practical choice but to accept all of the machine's decisions. As the society and the problems that face it become more and more complex, machines become more and more intelligent, people will let machines make more and more of the decisions simply because those machines will be better than the ones made by men. Eventually, a stage may be reached at which all the decisions necessary to keep the systems running will be so complex that human beings will be incapable of making them intelligently. At that stage, the machines will be in effective control. People won't be able to turn off the machines because they will be so dependent on them that turning them off would amount to suicide. He then says, on the other hand, it is possible that human control over the machines may be retained. In that case, the average man may have control over certain private machines of his own, such as his cars, but due to the improved techniques, the elite will have greater control over the masses. And because human work will no longer be necessary, the masses will essentially be superfluous. If the elite is ruthless, they may simply decide to exterminate the mass of humanity. If they are humane, they may use propaganda or other psychological behavior techniques to reduce the birth rate until the mass of humanity becomes extinct, leaving the world to the elite. Or if the elite consists of soft-hearted liberals, they may decide to play the role of good shepherds to the rest of the human race. They will see to it that everyone's physical needs are satisfied. Of course, life will be so purposeless that people will have to be biologically or psychologically engineered either to remove their needs for the need for the power processes. All right. So in the book, you don't discover until you turn the page that the author of that passage is Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Now, Joy writes, I am no apologist for Kaczynski. His bombs killed 3 people during a 17-year terror campaign and wounded many others. One of his bombs gravely injured my friend, David Gellertner, one of the most brilliant and visionary computer scientists of our time. Like many of our colleagues, I felt I could have been the Unabomber's next target. His actions were murderous and criminally insane. He is clearly a Luddite, but simply saying this does not dismiss his argument. As difficult as it is for me to acknowledge, I saw some merit in the reasoning in this single passage, and I felt compelled to confront it. All right, so let me just pause there because that's pretty striking. I think that little section there. And so Ben Chin has his hand raised.
There are parts of this that are very dated.
Well, it's 21 years old, so
Right.
sure.
So
Which one? Sholom? Is Sholom dated or Joy dated? I'm kidding.
no,
obviously.
Joy, of course, is much more dated than Sholom, because anytime you talk about technology,
You're already dated. That's right.
You're already dated. I mean, this is not. I think that this was a goal of those involved in creating, what we call AI, artificial intelligence, 20 years ago. I don't think this is even the goal anymore. We have found that things that we thought things are harder for machines than we thought they would be. We can't even get them to reliably drive a car. And we've been trying for quite a long time to be able to get them to do that. And the more people try to make that happen, the further off into the distance that goal seems to recede. And so I think for those working in artificial intelligence, the goalposts have shifted significantly. And I think the state of the art now is to have computers focus on the things that they're actually good at, have human beings focus on the things they're actually good at, and find ways to put them together.
So why do you think using
achieve...
Sholom's frame then? That's interesting. So at the turn of the century, just like maybe messianism in the Lubavitch is at its peak, messianism in the scientific realm, utopianism, is similarly at a peak, right? Could you say that?
Well, I think it's the same impulse.
And now 21, yeah, that's
right. And there was the impulse. There's always been that impulse, I think, among the technological community toward a kind of either utopianism or dystopianism.
That's
right. I think the utopianism has shifted, right? There was a time, I think, for a long time, the whole promise of futurism that was born probably in mid-20th century, right, was that machines would do everything for us and we could kind of just lay back and relax, right? And robots would just take on all the work, right? And
we'd stay at home and it would deliver our food.
Right. Then sociologically, we found out that, oh, no, the more work that robots do, it doesn't mean that we have to do less work. It actually means that either number one, we're impoverished, or number two, those people that do have work actually end up working even more in this scenario. So it was sociologically economically falsified last century. And this century, it's been sort of technologically scientifically falsified. Like, no, turns out there are really, really, really hard problems for computers that just may not be worth solving. Like, it's just not. It's not worth it.
All right. So Ben makes an interesting claim. I'm not sure I agree. But he's saying that the technological utopianism that was expressed and experienced around the turn of the century has significantly died out.
No, I think it's still with us. I think it's just shifted in its aims. I think now the aim is to get machines and human beings to fuse in some way, to have a human-machine hybrid.
Does that scare you? Does the transition from that state to this state frighten you in the birth pangs of the Messiah way that Sholom is describing?
It's less scary. It's less scary than a world in which we have no significant role at all, right? But it's still very different. And so, yes, kind of scary, I suppose. But yeah, I think the bottom line is, it's the same. It's the same impulse, right? And what you were talking about, of trying to bring about either the utopia or the dystopia that will push us forward essentially into the world to come.
And our tradition warns us about this rather starkly, as we read here. Dara.
Yes, I just wanted to mention a book that I just read, which you may have heard of, the new book by Ishiguro called Clara and the Sun. Kazuo Ishiguro, the author of Remains of the Day. And his book is narrated by an artificial intelligence, artificial friend. And it's set in sort of a dystopian near future world where, you know, many of the things that, thank you, many of the things that were mentioned in that, you know, Unabomber's prediction were sort of delineated in terms
Do
of
you
like,
feel like Joy, because we're going to go further in Joy here. Do you feel like he does the need to confront the Unabomber's philosophy?
well, that's what he's, I mean, that's.
Do you,
kind of-
but do you personally, do you feel like?
Well, I think the main issue of the book and what I've been thinking about is they get to this question of, you know, what is a human life, and can a man-made artificial being in some way take over and substitute for human life? And that to me is the central question of the book, and what I found so compelling about it. Yeah, I think that is.
No spoilers. No spoilers. I love it.
But anyway, I think that is it. I think that is an important question, whether it's in the, I mean, I appreciate what Ben was saying, but it seems to me that these questions are more philosophical than actually practical. You know, people were thinking, oh, there's going to be some fusion of man and machine, and, you know, it seemed like all big ideas. And yes, you're right. Over time, you know, we find out what's, you know, like jet packs never happened. You know, we were always thinking that we were going to be able to fly around with jet packs, and that never happened. So I don't know really what my point is, but I think the big questions are the philosophical questions. And, you know, as we see what is practical, then, you know, it becomes clear.
I guess my point is that I think the philosophical thrust impacts the pragmatism. Like, I mean, the fact that we have Star Trek technology comes from the fact that the scientists grew up watching Star Trek, wanting to build those things. So there's a philosophy that is baked into the system that comes to manifest itself. Mark.
I just want to say, and I don't know if this is a coincidence or not, but that philosophy is straight out of the Matrix. Like, I don't know which one came first. I mean, that was in the Unabomber's writings, came way before the Kowalski brothers, whatever they are now, wrote the Matrix. But it's literally exactly that kind of philosophy. Like, we're eventually going to become sort of line of machines, then they're going to become sentient beings, and they're going to go to war with us. And I think that reflects a lot of the way people had felt at the end of the 1990s. I mean, just thinking of pop culture, you have Terminator also with Skynet. And I think I don't agree that that's the sentiment anymore. I actually agree a lot with what Ben had said, where I think we've moved on from that now. And I think we are kind of moving toward this somewhat infusion of people with technology. I don't necessarily think that there's as much of a fear.
Do you want, Mark, let me interrupt you. Do you want additional appendages? I mean, is that appealing to you?
I don't want additional appendages, but I mean, look, like if God forbid I develop a cancer and I have to get some body part removed and we can use stem cells to regrow it, why not?
Or if you break your neck, and we can use technology to give you artificial limbs, why not? But I can also use that same technology to give you 6 arms. I can make you, what's that guy in Spider-Man? what's his name? He's got 8 arms.
Dr. Octopus?
Right. First of all, so let's say you break your neck, right? I could, they have this, they're really close to having this technology at this point. They have monkeys who are able to eat with robotic hands at this point. What would prevent me from giving you 8 arms and making you Doc Ock? Like, why? I mean, why not? And like, what's
Medical
the limit
ethics?
then? And well, what's that? I mean, who decides?
I guess as medicine moves forward, there would have to be some sort of baselines set, and I don't know exactly like who would be the ones to set that, but I personally don't see it to that regard. I see, a way to use like stem cells, for example, to help restore things that people lose. So if I chop off my finger, I can get it grown back or something like that. I don't necessarily see like enhancements that are completely artificial and that humans never evolved to have to begin with. Like, I
You mean
don't.
you can't imagine some billionaire buying his own island and enhancing himself? That's too far-fetched.
I mean, I can see that happening. I just don't see that like becoming widely accepted in society.
Well, I think Marx
Ben?
put his finger on what is now the new horizon, which is no longer robotics. It's medical technology.
Yeah.
Right. And CRISPR, especially genetic manipulation, which is less about you growing an extra arm than you deciding essentially the genetic makeup of your children. Right. That's now that's a whole nother utopian or dystopian future where we can, down to a perhaps very fine-grained level, decide on the entire genome of the next generation, right? And have a super race, or that's another kind of world to come, right?
Well,
where humanity as we know it no longer exists, and we manufacture something else, not by creating robots that are going to take over, but by creating other human beings.
I mean, we're already kind of starting to do that if you think about it now. And like, we have genetic testing for pregnant women, and in some places, like, people will have elective abortions if they find out that the kids that they are due to have some sort of medical issues, whereas 50 years ago they would be born and unfortunately suffer their whole lives. Now they're just aborted and they're never born to begin with. So that's already kind of happening to an extent. I don't know if we're getting to the point of something like out of Brave New World, which I think is what you were kind of talking about, where like we were literally like people were harvested and like genetically designed. Like, I don't know if we're obviously not there yet, and I don't see us getting there, but we are. We are in some regard, I guess.
All right, so good. So stay there. So stay there for a second. Let's look at some Torah. So this week's Torah portion. I was studying this week's Torah portion, and these ideas sort of struck me, and I'm going to pull it up for you right here. It's just one line in the Torah portion this week. Do not allow any of your offspring to be offered up to Moloch, and do not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Okay, so what in the world is Moloch that we're not allowed to offer up it? So this commentary here is Rashi's in the middle here. This was an idol, the name of which was Moloch, and this was the manner in which it was worshipped. Now, Moloch, you might recognize the word melech. It's the same root, but it doesn't imply an individual sovereign. It implies the notion of sovereignty itself, of fate and destiny itself. It's higher than any individual sovereign. So this was the idea of the name of which was Moloch. And this was the manner in which it was worshipped. The father handed his child over to the priests of the idol. These two lit large pyres, one opposite the other, and made the child to pass on foot between the two pyres. Okay, so that's from the Talmud. So let's go over to the Sanhedrin. Rabbi Ain says, one is not liable for passing his child through the fire to Moloch unless he hands him over to the priests of Moloch. The other one says it's also taught, depends on whether or not he handed this child over to the priest willingly or voluntarily. Now, the idea here is that there is some sort of ancient Near Eastern practice, which we find in our Torah portion, which has to do with, we don't take our children. This is how I can best explain this. I think I can best explain it as such. It's dangerous. when you bring a child into the world. And especially back 3,000, 3,500 years ago, there's mortality rate was high. A lot of kids died, and a lot of them died by fate or by accident. And so there was some priest of Moloch who was responsible for appeasing or tempting those fates. And by passing your child through some sort of inoculation involving fire, you are able to inoculate your child from those forces of fate that this sort of fate person was bringing about. And so there's this idea that we shouldn't necessarily give in to some of those naturalistic or supernatural faiths, that we should try to appreciate that there is one God. And I want to take this from here, go right back to Bill Joy, because he says that he got involved in computers from the age of 3. He was already reading. His father took me to the elementary school. I sat on the principal's lap, read him a story. I skipped a grade. I escaped into books. As a teenager, I was interested in science and technology. I wanted to be a ham radio operator. He says, I may not have had many close friends, but I was awash in ideas. By high school, I had discovered science fiction in Heinlein and Asimov and the 3 laws of robotics. I was enchanted by the descriptions of space travel. Thursday nights, my parents went bowling and I would watch Star Trek. And he came to accept its notion that humans had a future in space. He excelled in math in high school. He went to Michigan. He solved math problems. Okay, this goes on and on. After a few years at Berkeley, he started to send out some software he wrote. By the 80s, he was drowning, Unix, by that. Okay. So from this, he wants you to know that he's not a Luddite. I've always rather had a strong belief in the value of the scientific search for truth and in the ability of great engineering to bring material progress. The Industrial Revolution has immeasurably improved everybody's lives over the last couple of 100 years, and I always expected my career to involve the building of worthwhile solutions to real problems, one problem at a time. I have not been disappointed. My work has had more impact than I could have ever hoped for. I spent the last 20 years still trying to figure out how to make computers as reliable as they want them to be. But while I was aware of the moral dilemmas surrounding technology consequences in the fields like weapons research, I did not expect that I would confront it in my own field. Okay, so he goes on here, perhaps in terms, all right, he goes here. By 2030, we are likely to build machines in quantity 1 million times as powerful as the personal computers today. He goes on to talk about some of those things that Ben was talking about. We've changed perhaps away from this notion of robotics into an idea of us merging with our machines. He says here, genetic engineering promises to revolutionize agriculture. Technologies such as human cloning have raised our awareness of ethical and moral issues we face. Okay, so he's trying to figure out where he sits in all of this. And he says, I remember feeling good about nanotechnology after reading Engines of Creation. As a technologist, it gave me a sense of calm. That is, nanotechnology showed us that incredible progress was possible and indeed perhaps inevitable. If nanotechnology was our future, then I didn't feel pressed to solve so many problems in the present. Okay, so there's these visions that perhaps nanotechnology can solve our problems in the future. But hold on, this goes on a little bit longer than I anticipated. Okay. In most of all other power of destructive, okay, he talks about genetics, nanotechnology, and robots. And he talks about the dangers in all of 3. And he says that the nuclear, biological, and chemical technologies used in the 20th century weapons of mass destruction were largely military. In the 21st century, the GNR technologies that have clear commercial uses and are used by corporations. In this age of commercialism, it's often the corporations that are now delivering this new technology. This is the first moment in history of our planet when any species, by its own voluntary actions, has become a danger to itself, as well as to a vast numbers of others. He quotes here from Carl Sagan. It might be a familiar progression transpiring on many words. A planet, newly formed, placidly revolves around its star. Life slowly forms, a kaleidoscopic procession of creatures evolves. Intelligence emerges, which at least up to a point, confers enormous survival value, and then technology is invented. It dawns on them that there are such things as the laws of nature, that these laws can be revealed by experiment, and that knowledge of these laws can be made both to save and to take lives, both on unprecedented scales. Science, they recognize, grants immense powers. In a flash, they create world-altering contrivances. Some planetary civilizations see their way through, place limits on what may and must not be done, and safely pass through the time of perils. Others, not so lucky or so prudish, perish. And that is Carl Sagan writing in 1994. So he writes here, Joy writes, I remember from my childhood that my grandmother was strongly against the overuse of antibiotics. She had worked since before the First World War as a nurse and had a common sense attitude that taking antibiotics, unless they were absolutely necessary, was bad for you. It is not that she was an enemy of progress. She saw much progress in an almost 70-year nursing career. But she, like many level-headed people, would probably think it greatly arrogant for us now to be designing a robotic replacement species, or maybe to be modifying our RNA or our DNA, when we obviously have so much trouble making relatively simple things work and so much trouble managing or even understanding ourselves. I realize now that she had an awareness of the nature of the order of life and of the necessity of living with and respecting that order. Now, of the three impulses that Sholom represented, he's clearly here representing the conservative impulse, which is obviously why I'm sharing it. With this respect comes a necessary humility that we, with our early 21st century chutzpah, lack at our peril. The common sense view, grounded in this respect, is often right in advance of the scientific evidence. The clear fragility and inefficiencies of the human-made system we have built should give us all pause. The fragility of the systems I have worked on certainly humbles me. We should have learned a lesson from the making of the first atomic bomb and the resulting arms race. We didn't do it well then, and the parallels to our current situation are troubling. The effort to build the first atomic bomb was led by Oppenheimer. He was not naturally interested in politics, but became painfully aware of what he perceived as the grave threat of the Nazis. Energized by that concern, he brought his intellect to Los Alamos and led a rapid and successful effort. What is striking is how this effort continued so naturally after the initial impulse was removed. In a meeting shortly after VE Day with some physicists who felt that perhaps the effort should stop, Oppenheimer argued to continue. His stated reasons seem a bit strange, not because of the fear, but because the United Nations, which was soon to be formed, should have foreknowledge of atomic weapons. A more likely reason that the project continued is the momentum that had already been built up. Okay, so Oppenheimer in November of 1945, 3 months after the bombings, stood firmly behind the scientific attitude, saying it is not possible to be a scientist unless you believe that the knowledge of the world and the power which this gives is a thing which is of intrinsic value to humanity, and that you are using it to help in the spread of knowledge and are willing to take on the consequences. 2 years later, Oppenheimer reached a different conclusion, saying, in some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge that they cannot lose. Okay, so let me just pause there. Okay, Don.
Yeah, every time I hear these kinds of discussions, whatever we do genetically to ourselves or robotically, or if we're taken over by machines, whatever, that can we ever lose, though, in whatever state we're in and however horrible it becomes, could we ever lose our connection to God? That connection, or I'm saying, that connection cannot be genetically removed. It cannot be robotically removed. It cannot be removed by anything that is material or of the earthly plane, so that the connection is never lost. We want to make it as good as we can down here, peace, prosperity for all. But in the end, whatever we do not lose our connection to the Lord. And
that's right. And that's what we see throughout the Psalms. But Don, we are in Egypt sometimes, and we are in Auschwitz sometimes. And those are moments in which it is very hard to perceive that connection to the Lord.
absolutely. But I think that as a society, if we can keep that in our minds, in our forethoughts, then we rise up out of Egypt quicker.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little fearful. I guess I have a little fear about a coming catastrophe. All right, so I'll put my cards on the table. The idea I inhabit the rabbinic persona of the conservative rabbi who wants the Messiah to come next year. Okay, that's who I am. And this idea of, and of course, I embody that, this worry of when we take powers into our own hands that the Talmud and our tradition cautions us about. And so I think I often try to utilize the tradition as to provide a space, and this is how I've been promoting it recently, especially in the light of COVID, provide a space in which we can protect those things that are most valuable to us. So like Don, like a place apart. So Kedusha, we say at the Havdalah, La Havdil Ben Kodesh L'chol. We give thanks to a God that makes distinctions between the mundane and the holy. And I think our tradition tries to give us boundaries, halakha, like fences, around those things that we want to protect, that are most human and most holy to us. The relationships with God, relationships with loved ones, relationship with family, with the community. And I think to a certain extent, the Jewish tradition and the halakha is completely countercultural in that regard, in that it wants to keep technology at bay because it wants to preserve a sense of the humanness that's totally valuable. And I love your spirit, your kavanah, which says, doesn't matter, Hashem is always with us. Sure, I get it, that's beautiful. But I'd like it to be maybe more with us as often as possible. You know what I'm saying? And the more I can amplify that for people in their lives, the more, God willing, peace there will be. Howard, you're muted, Howard. Try again, Howard.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're okay. This kind of talk got me thinking about, did you know that the University of Chicago, I guess in the 30s and 40s, had a pretty good football program? Atomic research ended it. The research was done in laboratories under this football field. And it got so hot down there, nobody could play in it anymore. And there seems to be a message from God there. I'm not quite sure what it was. If you go out there, you'll see in front of it, there's a library now instead of a football field, and a big atomic statue or something. But the point is, you never know what's going to happen when you do these things. And it's just incredible what people can do. And right now, with all the brilliance in developing and create, like Ben was talking about, you were talking about, the fact is, kids don't learn anything. They can't read and write. There's some brilliant ones that can, but I would rather have, I can go on and blabber, I guess, but the fact is, people are right now looking too much for things to be done for them without thinking. And that's really frightening for the future as far as I'm concerned.
And you know, that sentiment there, harkens back to Ted Kaczynski's writings. And I think that the fact that you feel that, and Bill Joy felt that 21 years ago, and Ted Kaczynski felt that 20 years prior. I mean, that guy was an evil madman, crazy killer, terrible human being, terrible, terrible person. And that's what can happen when this impulse takes over. Dara, you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to thank Howard for that, because my son went to University of Chicago, and we always lamented the decision to, to demote U Chicago from like a Pac-12 team. And the story always was that, it was about the life of the mind, and we're not going to play sports anymore, et cetera, et cetera. But I never heard this tidbit. So that's very valuable. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Howard. We're going to close. I'll close with one additional story from Brandeis University, Howard. Brandeis University, the famous story is that the first president of Brandeis, Abe Sacker, got $1 million gift. And by the way, you might not have known this, Brandeis had a reasonably good football team early days, even beat Harvard. And Abe Sacker said, if I get $1 million donation and I have to choose between a library and a football stadium, I'm going to choose the library. And he shut down the football team entirely. That's why there's no Brandeis team. Anyway, with that, thank you all for a really lovely participation. I want you to know in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a special discussion. Ephraim Margolin is going to join us. So be on the lookout for that. I think that's going to be on May 5th. And any other topics, if anybody wants to discuss any of these topics, this is an area of particular concern for me, especially as Dara noted, we get down to the deeper philosophical issues that sit at the heart of these new technologies and this new world that we're obviously all entering into. So with that, I want to wish you all a good week, and I will see you soon. Take care.
You know.